Doing well. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And welcome to our rejuvenated Halaqa session on basically how we use social media, right? So it's going to be pretty laid back. The idea and the subtext of the title is about critical thinking in the social media age. And the reason for having this is because the reality is that we're all on social media. That's how people communicate. That's how people connect. If you completely disengage and you shut down all your accounts, you're just going to be completely isolated. But then there are healthy ways to use social media and there are unhealthy ways. So we want to try and figure out, what are some best practices. So the first thing that we want to kind of get out of the way is why it's important. In Surah Al-Isra, Allah says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ, and never concern yourself with anything of which you have no knowledge. Verily, your hearing and sight and heart, all of them will be called to judgment for it on the judgment day. And in every verse in the Quran, ears are mentioned before eyes. And I think a lot of people kind of preoccupied, they're like, oh, on social media, they're haram images. That's not the presentation today because that's so obvious, so self-explanatory. We don't necessarily, and that's a different presentation. What we're talking about is the toxicity of ideas and thinking and information that happens and the way in which ideas are exchanged in social media and how to get away from that. So there's a reason in all of the verses, ears are mentioned first before sight. And that's also because with your eyes, you can control it. You can close your eyes, you can shut it down, but your ears is something passive. You hear information, whether you want to or you don't want to, it still affects you. So similarly, when you're receiving information, even people who are not on social media today are affected by social media. I don't have a Twitter account, but what happens on Twitter affects me because it impacts the world that we live in. And the way things are going, I don't even know if Twitter is going to exist for that long. Like I mentioned, Juma, it's imploding on its own. It's a $40 billion. Was it 40 billion? I think so. $40 billion. It's more than 40, but it was supposed to be 50, but I think he got a discount. He bought it on sale, because of all the bots. The other thing is that social media is weird. Socially, we use social media because it's entertaining, but then we also get information. And that's the problem, which is that when you look at influencers, when you look at videos, when you look at what people are posting, there's information in there, but the motivation is to engage and to entertain as many people as possible so that a hybrid arrangement creates no separation, in which there's time in which you have downtime, in which you're truly relaxing, and then other times in which you're learning and your mind is completely engaged. So we're kind of, instead with social media, we're getting tidbits of information, but we never really learn about anything specifically completely. Now, the last thing I mentioned there is 2 hours and 29 minutes. Anybody know what that is? That is the average amount of time that a person spends on social media per day, which is insane. I think the grad students, medical students are no, that's impossible. Right? But people do, because they start first thing when they open their phone in the morning, and those notifications, that's how they get me. I get the notification, otherwise I wouldn't open the app. But then it says oh, you got a message from so-and-so, and then I click it, and then once it's open, then I see other stuff, and then you kind of get roped in. So a couple of things that are issues. Why is it a problem? The first thing is it kind of homogenizes everybody because it elevates, popular culture, this idea of fitting in and meeting social expectations. And I think in the past, especially growing up in the 90s, it was a little bit different because it was the complete opposite. It was about being countercultural, being goth was in, and heavy metal. People were angry, they wanted to be different. But now I think society has shifted in a different direction where everyone is more competitive. And rather than asserting their individuality, people are trying to conform in a way that I think is really unhealthy and try to keep up with each other. The other reason that it's really damaging is because social media elevates what's external. because obviously, especially photographs, Instagram is also one of the platforms where that probably happens more than, say, Twitter. I mean, TikTok is probably the worst offender in terms of elevating form over substance, right? Because everything is about the physical, everything is about what's external. People are not really talking about internal aspects. It also forces a person to kind of seek validation. And some people would say, no, I'm just posting for myself. But the reality is, most people, when they post, what's the first thing they're looking for? What are they waiting for? They're waiting for likes. So people want that feedback. They want that engagement. They want the comments. And so what ends up happening is like you're kind of teaching yourself to seek validation, right? And to get that appreciation from other people. And so everybody would be like, oh, you do you. But then there's a bit of irony, because, it's like an uplifting message, but then it's kind of wrapped in something which is not so uplifting. And I mentioned marketing psychology because we don't really realize it, but there's a lot of messaging that happens. Whether I mentioned this a few weeks ago in a khutbah, in which I talked about how we think that our ideas are our own, but like we're driving and we're like, why am I hungry? You're hungry because you saw a billboard that had the right colors on it. You think that so-and-so is beautiful. Why do you think that? You think because you watched movies in which that person was like the embodiment of beauty. And so like the standards that you have, you think that like you form those ideas and those impressions on your own, but in reality, society had a big part of that. So here we're going to talk about some issues, and then we're going to talk about what the solutions are. And then inshallah, we can have a discussion because we want to emphasize what are the best practices. That's most of the presentation. So the problem is also reduced accountability. People behave very badly on social media. The only thing that people behave even worse is probably dating apps. Because there's complete anonymity. People feel like they can get away with saying or doing whatever they want. And so because there's no accountability, they say things that they would never say in real life, in real situations in which there's some kind of accountability. And it's also an environment in which there's no trust, right? So when people are commenting or when people are having one of those debates, there's no mutual understanding. They always assume the other person means it in the worst possible way. And you'll see sometimes people in comments will kind of go at it. And like in reality, they agree. But they're just fighting because they're coming from a place of aggression. It also kind of encourages people to have conspiratorial theories, because the more time that you spend on social media, then you feel like, oh, this can be manipulated, this can be changed, what's real? So things that you just assume as being a fact lose credibility because you're on a platform in which there's no credibility. Then there's this, so that's on a higher level, information level. Then there's the social atomization. I think a lot of people use social media as a replacement. And part of that is because of the physical mobility that we live in, especially post-COVID. A lot of people have moved. People don't stay in one state or one area for more than 2 or 3 years, especially for the age demographic that we have in YP. People move every 2 or 3 years. It's a lot of work to make new friendships, meet new people, create new relationships. And so what ends up happening is social media is a lot easier because then you're reconnecting with people from high school. You're also you don't have to go out. You don't have to come to ICCP on a cold day, right? And it's just so much easier just to like a photo or talk to people and you feel connected. So deep down, there's like this need and this want that we all want to connect with someone. But because we don't have those actually in-person relationships like that, so we're using social media to fill that gap. So there's really a vacuum. And that's a really, really unhealthy use of social media. I think a healthy use of social media is to stay in touch with people that are not your close friends. I think that's a great way of using social media because there are a lot of people who you're not going to just call randomly. But then you're able to see, like, they post they post photos from their wedding, they're on a vacation, and then you're like, oh, and then let's catch up. Or they're like, oh, I'm on a business trip in Denver and you live in Denver. And you're like, oh, hit me up when you're in town, we'll hang out. That is a great use of social media. I wish people used it that way, but they don't. What ends up happening is this social atomization where people feel disconnected because they're not part of something. And that's also why a place like ICCP is really special. Because if you're part of YP, you're part of this circle. If you're part of the YP circle, you're part of the ICCP circle. If you're in ICCP, now you're connected to other people. And I think that cohesion is really, really important for a person's identity. Echo chambers. This is something more on the political spectrum, but what ends up happening is that you're only going to talk to people who agree with you, right? So like conservatives become more conservative, progressives become even more progressive. Have you guys witnessed that with religion though? I think this happens as well. And I think it can happen, not to pick on the guys, but I think there's a whole like male Muslim social media scene. You guys know what I'm talking about. Like Andrew Tate becoming Muslim did not help that in any way. But there's like all these angry men, and I don't know who broke up with them or why they're so butthurt, but they're mad about something. Like, I don't know what happened to them, but they're really damaged. And they're just angry at women, and they're like so upset about feminism. And so I think what ends up happening is like people are not thinking about issues in a deep way, and there's more polarization within the Muslim community, whether it's on that issue of feminism, about gender roles, whether it's on the issue of like conservative and liberal, which is a very tough spectrum, and nobody really knows what that means. Whether it's on the spectrum of like Salafi or Sufi, which those two are not necessarily opposites either, but then there are all these different spectrums, and people feel the need to choose a side. And I think that itself is really problematic because they feel like they need to take a stance on every single subject, and which in reality, it doesn't necessarily have to be something you get involved in. There's also like degeneration of social values. So what do I mean by that? I feel like this is kind of a reference to woke culture, because I feel like a lot of young Muslims, they know what Islamic values are, but at the same time, they feel like, okay, these are our allies, they're on our side, we have to be with them. Society is moving in a particular direction, and so we need to move with it. And that's especially common among activists. A lot of people don't realize, but there's stereotyping of Muslims among Muslims, and I think we're all guilty of doing this. Like we see a person's appearance and we make certain assumptions about them. And I think any kind of media, including social media, reinforces that. Difficulty distinguishing reality. This is a problem, especially in personal relationships, because people see a lot of images of influencers, of supermodels, of celebrities, and they don't realize how curated it is. So everything in their own life never seems good enough, right? Because they're comparing to the standard which isn't real. And I think that social media is different from like Hollywood, or like if you're watching a movie on Netflix, you're like, oh, that's Netflix. But social media is kind of like, it's very pervasive. Like it's like in your own mind, and those images are like very close, and then it starts affecting how you think about reality. The next one is a very real problem, which is body image issues. I feel like in the past, everybody had insecurities about their appearance and how they look. But I feel like when people post things on social media, others feel like commenting about them is now fair game. Does that make sense? It's like, well, you posted the photos, so like you wanted us to talk about your body, right? So I feel like that has created like a whole genre. And whether it doesn't matter whether it's negative or positive. Our Islamic perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's shaming or something positive. It's just a matter of it's not part of the public domain. You know, that like it's not really for public consumption to make those type of comments, even if it's positive. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is the algorithm, because social media, it calculates like what your interests are. It actually even geolocates. So like you're here at ICCP and it sees that we're all using the same IP address. And then you're going to leave and then you're going to get like similar, we're all going to get similar ads just because we met up. So the algorithm kind of figures out, you know, what you might be interested in based on your location. This is a story that I shared a couple of Fridays ago in with Uthman was confronted by Muhammad, the son of Abu Bakr. And everybody knows Abu Bakr, right? The best friend of the Prophet ﷺ. He was born on the day of the farewell Hajj, and Uthman actually saw a dream that he was breaking his fast with Abu Bakr and with Umar. And Muhammad, he comes with a sword and he wants to kill Uthman, right? Because of some political grievance. And Uthman, all he says to him, he said, "What happened to you?" And when he was posed with that question, he realized, like, what am I doing? Because he had been surrounded by people who had indoctrinated him and brainwashed him. And so today's brainwashing is different because in the past, it required people with a certain political agenda to present ideas about what's right and what's wrong, to create extreme choices. But nowadays, our brainwashing is self-inflicted. We kind of start consuming some ideas. Like you go on YouTube, like just try it. Like Google on YouTube, search on YouTube, you know, the earth is flat. Watch one video about the earth being flat. For days, you're just going to get YouTube videos showing up with all kinds of crazy theories because YouTube has decided that you're crazy. So they're like, this guy's crazy, so let's keep giving him crazy videos. So they give you what you want. And so people's sense of like what's right, they're like, but everybody's saying it. So if everybody's saying it, it must be true. And then, of course, deep fakes, that's a big problem. And the problem is like sometimes it's going to be mixed. There's a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ was asked about soothsayers, and he said the problem with them is not that everything's a lie. This is the problem with Donald Trump. If everything Donald Trump said was a lie, it would be easy. He would have no credibility. Some of what he says is very true. And herein lies the problem. Because there's one word of truth, and the Prophet ﷺ said they add 100 lies into the mix. And so it becomes hard to discern. So what are the best practices? So I have some tips for us. The first thing is like, before we share things, verify, you know. Some people overshare, like too many thoughts, too many ideas. They read an article, they're like, oh, this is great. What's the basketball player that shared the movie? Kyrie. He literally did not even write a single comment. He just shared the link. And look at how much trouble he got into. So before you share something, just check it out and figure out what you're doing. The other thing, I think this is a big one that no one talks about, is jealousy. Because what ends up happening is like, we'll go through social media, we'll see what other people are doing, and we'll end up envying others because they're presenting a certain image of themselves. And it can actually be harmful to ourselves because we're putting ourselves in a position in which we wish that we could be like other people. So that's another thing that you want to kind of prevent. A positive use of social media is use it for personal and spiritual development. There are so many channels, there's so many people that post on social media, really, really uplifting messages, short ones. I think in the past, like we've had Sheikh Saad Taslim. That's a great example of somebody who posts, who has like a podcast. And I don't know, he hasn't been posting that much recently though. But he used to post all the time these very, very short videos, and they would have like a single message and they were like really, really beneficial. So that's an example of somebody who you can refer back to for personal and spiritual development, and try to keep it positive, because there are people who are going to take you, they're always going to be talking about issues and problems, and like people tell you this, and then there are other people who have an uplifting and a positive message. So I think it's very important to gravitate to the ones, and that applies to religion as well. Like there's some people who are like, all Muslims are bad, the ummah is falling down, the sky is falling. And then there are other people who are like really sharing an uplifting message. And I think that's the premise behind like Yaqeen Institute, for example. For a regular Muslim, for a regular practitioner, somebody who's not a student of knowledge, watching their videos, it can be a very uplifting experience because the way that they present it is different. It's not like they don't have anything new that's different, but they present it in a way that makes people feel good. Etiquette of commenting. This is a big one. I think a lot of our comments would be different if we just took one moment to pause before we clicked it. Can you imagine? I mean, imagine if we did the same thing with our speech. Like before we said anything, we just took a moment. There was a movie like years ago with a guy that had a remote control in life where he could like rewind and fast forward. Yes, the Jim Carrey one. Yeah. It's actually really funny. But then he kind of used it and abused it, right? But it would be useful if you could rewind, because there's so many things that we do and that we say that we probably shouldn't have said. And there's so many situations where the best course of action is to do nothing. This is a big one that I want you guys to think about. If you're looking for entertainment, then invest in deep friendships, in real relationships. People are not proactive about their friendships. When you meet someone that you like, be like, hey, can I get your phone number? Let's connect, let's hang out. People don't text each other. Like, what are you guys doing this weekend? There's no intentionality behind it, And I think that if your social interactions are more, it doesn't have to be planned. It can be spontaneous, because people think like, oh, it's got to be spontaneous. It can't be planned. But if you seek entertainment that way, then you're not going to be one of those people that's on social media for 2 hours and 29 minutes, because you'd rather, like, you have a limited number of hours in your day. You'd rather get entertainment from, like, go watch a movie. Like, there aren't a lot of people watching movies now because they're on social media. It has completely taken over the space. Like even today's match in Qatar, if you look at the stands, it was like half empty. Right? People's attention span, like halfway through them. Well, also, they were playing Ecuador, right? So apparently they didn't realize they had to practice before they hosted the World Cup. And so, their own fans were like ditching the game in the middle and started leaving. So I think like reclaim your downtime, have moments in which you're not doing anything, when you're not, like, also for couples, this is a big one. Have time in the day in which you're just sitting and facing each other and not doing anything, not on the phone, not doing anything, not running around, just like sitting and like facing each other. Because that kind of interaction in which you're just like 100% focused on the other is very, very important. Social media reduces the quality of our in-person interactions because there's this constant interruption. So that's a big one to pay attention to. And hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion, exchange of ideas, thoughts that I didn't mention. There's like dozens of ideas here. So there's so much more that could be said.